Welcome to episode 11 of Alternate Realities, the podcast series where we literally look at alternate realities, different perspectives on life. My guest today is the very inspirational Jo Jukes. Jo has had a particularly tough journey over the last few years. She was married to somebody who was in the serving military and who had a particularly difficult journey with PTSD. And unfortunately, Dave eventually took his own life. Suicide is not an easy subject matter, but it is one that we do need to talk about. We need much more research into how we can help people before they get to the point where they feel they can go on no longer. I do need to give a trigger warning for today's episode because it is a particularly open and honest conversation, but I'm sure many people will find it both informative and hopefully very helpful. A very warm welcome this afternoon to Jo Jukes, who's come to join us and talk about her husband who sadly died from his own hand and all the things, the incredible inspirational things that she's been doing with her life since. So welcome, Jo. Lovely to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
So could we start with you telling us how you met Dave?
I met Dave through family friends, and at first I thought he was a little bit mad. He was quite boisterous. He was like an overexcited puppy.
Okay. And did you find that attractive?
A little bit. And a little bit not. A little bit kind of like, oh, he's quite hard. He's quite a lot to handle, isn't he? He's quite larger than life. I didn't know at the time that he was actually starting to suffer from the effects of his PTSD. He wasn't able to control it as much. So, you know, later on, I realised that was why he was maybe overcompensating with his personality, you know, kind of in your face a little bit, covering up some of the things that were going on in his head, really.
So when did you actually meet Dave?
2006, yeah. And we were in a short-term relationship at first, purely because over the couple of months that we were together, he became a little bit too much to handle, a little bit too high maintenance. Yeah, and I think when you're first seeing someone, that can be a bit difficult to handle at first.
What made you turn it into something long-term?
Well, we split up because I wasn't quite ready for the kind of relationship that Dave wanted. From when we first met, he used to send me, it sounds bizarre, but he used to send me back my own pictures and say, this is the woman that one day I will marry. And I used to think, well, that's a bit crazy, isn't it? You know, we've only been seeing each other a couple of months. And his behaviour became a little bit more erratic, a little bit harder to handle. So, yeah, we finished. And about a year later, we got back in contact with each other. And he was like a completely different person. He was a lot calmer. He was a lot more easy to communicate. He was more approachable. He wasn't as in your face and hyperactive as what he was. And then it came about that in the meantime, in that year, he'd actually been sectioned and diagnosed with PTSD at that time. And he'd gone through some treatment. So he'd actually learned to manage his own mental health a little bit more. So, which explains why he was so much calmer.
So it's interesting that you saw such a massive difference in Dave in that time. When you got back together, did he make you aware of the PTSD and the reasons for it immediately, or was that something that came out later?
No, he mentioned it immediately because I noticed the change in him. I noticed the change in his personality. Even the way that he spoke was a lot slower. So before he used to speed talk and your head used to explode trying to keep up with what he was actually saying. Whereas he took pauses, he listened to what you said, and you could actually keep up with the conversation better. So it was quite noticeable. And he was quite honest about the fact that, he'd been diagnosed with PTSD and that he felt more in control of his mental health now. We were lucky in the fact of we were able to communicate quite effectively and talk about things like that quite openly with each other, which I don't think he'd ever experienced before with anyone else in his life. So, from that respect, we were always quite open about everything that was going on.
And of course, that's paramount in any relationship for it to have any longevity to it. But when you've got any kind of mental health issues, one of the hardest things for a lot of people is to know there's something wrong, but not know what's wrong. So when you've got somebody explaining to you what is going on with them and actually that they've had some treatment for it, it makes it clearer, doesn't it? But did that give you still any cause for concern at that point, or did you actually think that he really got it under control and there was much more of a handle on it?
I felt that there was much more of a handle on it, and I also, I think because I noticed the change in his personality and his behaviour, and I think because of the job that I was doing at the time, I'm a trained teacher, so that's what my training's in. I'm trained to communicate effectively and look behind people's behaviours and figure out what's going on and actually have an open communication. So I think that helped us to both open up a little bit more and understand where each of us were coming from. So from that respect, it didn't cause me any concern at all.
And he was still serving at the time?
Yes, he was based up in Newcastle at the time.
And when did you actually fully get together? When did you actually get married and make a permanent commitment?
So late 2008, we got together. We got married in 2010. It was quite fast after that, really, compared to what it was like before, because I think some of my reservations had gone because his behaviour was completely different. And I think I was ready at that time then to make a commitment to someone. And, I never forgot the fact that he kept sending me pictures of myself saying, I'm going to marry you one day. And the day we got married, he actually said, I told you I was going to marry you.
You see, I don't find that odd at all, because my father always described the way he met my mum as seeing her. I mean, he was in the Navy at the time, and he remembers seeing her across the room at a dance and literally elbowing his mate and saying, see that woman over there? I'm going to marry her, before they'd even spoken. And I'd only seen my husband, actually seen him for 3 weeks. I'd known him for 4 months, but only seen him for 3 weeks before we got married. So sometimes if you put the PTSD to one side for 1 minute, I think sometimes when a man really knows that he wants to be with somebody, that kind of is what it is, isn't it? It's just that they are smitten.
Yeah, I mean, I never, in all of the years that we were together, I never once doubted his commitment or his love, no matter how ill he got, no matter what happened. He would never have divorced. He would never have voluntarily left the marriage. For some reason, we were meant to be together, as in, he said quite proudly that I was the first woman that he'd never cheated on or even thought about cheating on. And he hadn't treated women nicely in the past. When he was younger, he was a typical army lad, the stereotypical army lad, years gone by. But yeah, he changed in the last, decade of his life. So when people say people can't change, they can when they're with the right person. And that's not derogatory towards anyone that he was with before. It just, it was maybe the wrong time and the wrong person for him.
Well, I think that applies to many relationships, when you actually feel that you want to be completely committed to somebody, when that happens and that commitment is coming from your heart, it is very different, isn't it? And also, perhaps he was a little bit older and a little bit more mature with it.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of weeks before he died, I mean, I'm friendly with a couple of his exes, because I don't believe in all this, you're an ex and we shouldn't get on. They had a history with him, and one of his exes spoke to me after he died, and she said, did you know he phoned me up 2 weeks before he died? And I said, no, I didn't know you were still in contact. And she said, I hope that doesn't offend you. And I'm like, no, not at all. It doesn't offend me. Because I had complete trust in him. I was secure in that relationship. I was secure in his love, in his commitment. There was never any need for me to question him talking to anyone or doing whatever he wanted to do, never came into my head. And she said, yeah, he said to me, you know what, I just want you to know, I'm really sorry for everything that I did when I was younger. And I just want you to know that I really love Jo, and I've never once even thought about cheating on her. She is the absolute love of my life. And when you hear that after someone has died, and the fact there was no ulterior motive for him making that phone call, I would never have known about it unless we had a conversation. And he didn't know we were going to have that conversation. So it's just nice to feel that love.
And how did you feel hearing that?
It felt like it validated everything that I felt, that he loved the family, he loved me, he was very committed. He would never have left. He would have worked through anything at all. In some ways that can make me quite sad sometimes, especially, at Christmas or Valentine's or things like that, because it was a once in a lifetime kind of relationship that we had. If you take aside the fact that he was ill, it was still a once in a lifetime. And it's like you never think you'll ever get that ever again. That was your chance to have that. And although I'm grateful that I experienced it, I'm also quite sad that I no longer have it.
Well, of course. And though this is what I always say to people when I, talk about the way I felt about my husband, all these years later, people very often say to me, well, why have you never remarried? And my answer is always the same. There's been relationships since, but I don't personally believe in divorce. I don't judge people, for getting divorced. It's a personal choice when people are in situations. But my belief is when you get married, it is for life. It is till death us do part. And mine certainly was. And I've never felt love on the same level. It's not about comparing the person. It's exactly what you're saying, Jo. It's about feeling the love on the level and knowing that no matter what, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, and till death us do part. And PTSD is an illness. It is something that affects people to a hugely debilitating degree at times. My mother had PTSD. She wasn't diagnosed with it. She was diagnosed as being neurotic because that's what it was like back then. But, it was glaringly obvious to me as a therapist that was what was wrong with her. And my parents stayed together because they had married. They've married for that reason. And I think it's the depth of that love, isn't it, that you have with someone?
Yes, and I remember when Dave was really at his worst, as in, when he was in crisis, and it was only a couple of weeks before he died. And I remember even professionals saying to me, why are you with this man? Like, look at everything that's happening and look at everything that he's now doing and how much danger you're in. And why would you still be with this man? And they almost turn it into, you start questioning yourself and start thinking, well, am I just making excuses? Am I just with this person blindly? And yet, they are all of these things that people looking outside in. And I remember sitting with my GP and in absolute floods of tears and saying to him, I can't get my head around the fact that all these professionals are telling me that it's domestic abuse. It's not. He's ill. And the GP said, no, there's always been an element of domestic abuse. And that's quite mind-blowing, because I then started questioning that it's because he's ill. It's not him as a person. But nobody around me would accept that. They all automatically wanted to say that it was, domestic abuse. It wasn't love, and why would I be so weak to put up with the way that he was behaving? That's quite hard.
Well, it's actually the opposite in terms of you being weak. It's a strength to be able to stand by somebody's side when they are suffering so greatly. And I truly, when I put my therapist head on, that side of me really hopes that you do see that now, because it is a strength to be able to stand at someone's side. And yes, their behavior may well be abusive at times, because that's the nature of the beast, but the beast is not the man.
And that's what I found myself constantly trying to educate people, psychiatrists, police, crisis management people. It felt like you were always battling someone to either not come in and judge you or judge him, but actually try and support. And I found that people weren't educated enough to be able to recognise that, to be able to support the family to remain as a unit.
It's interesting that you're saying that, Jo, because many years ago, and I am talking about almost 20 years ago now, I did some work with domestic violence and with groups of women. And I remember giving a talk to a local police department. And, the thing that interested me the most, if I'd looked around that room and I was just doing an observation of what people looked like, the guy that actually spoke to me and thanked me for the talk at the end, after everybody else was walking out the door, was one of the most alpha male macho types that you could, he was stereotypical what you'd expect a guy to look like and behave like when he put his uniform on as a police officer, And I always remember what he said to me. He thanked me profusely for my talk, and he said, "You've explained the dynamics of the situation with regards to domestic violence to the point that I will never go to another shout and feel the same way about it now, because I understand why, you've explained why people do what they do." And it just seems sort of a shame to be having this conversation with you all these years later, and there's not more of that understanding out there.
Yeah, it felt like I was being. I think towards the end, I felt like I was damned if I did, and I was damned if I didn't, because I was being judged on the fact that we had social services involved, we had women's aid involved, and all of those, because of how extreme the situation had become. And then, so you get judged in that way of, why are you putting this man in front of your children? Why should you have to stand in front of your children to protect them? At one point we had to go and sleep in the car at McDonald's drive-through, in the waiting area overnight, just to be safe, because nobody could offer us anywhere to go. We had no family, we had nowhere to go. And instead of putting things in place to help us, I just got people's judgment. And if I didn't then support Dave and try and help him, I'd then be judged, if he took his life. I couldn't do right for doing wrong. And in the end, it ended up in, a situation that it was just really hard to break out of.
What year was it when it started? I mean, you're describing that he had a period of time that he was in far more control of his actions and he was far calmer. What year was it when it started to get really bad?
It started as a trickle. It started when he came back from Afghanistan, which was in 2012. The nightmare started again. The impotence started, which a lot of people don't talk about, is part of PTSD as well. He started to become easier to agitate, but not to a massive degree. But I think because I'd already seen the before and after the last time that he was sectioned, I could recognise it that little bit more.
Yeah.
And it started as a trickle. It wasn't an all out, all of a sudden a full blown, he couldn't cope. It started out small and it progressively got worse and worse over the years. So it took from 2012 to 2018. I think that's another misconception that we deal with, is there's this misconception that it's all of a sudden going to be a full blown, I really need all of this help right now. And it really doesn't start like that. It starts on, you notice the little things. And that's really when intervention needs to be put in place. The little things. Nip it in the bud as soon as we notice those little things. And it stops it from becoming the big problem that we ended up with.
Well, it's about a holistic, well-rounded treatment plan. And that seems to be the thing to me, the more I speak to people, that seems to be missing. And, I've had my own journey with PTSD, and, most of the time when people speak to me, they can't imagine me being anxious, with all the things I do, like podcasting and all the things I do in my life. They can't imagine the symptoms and all the things that go with it when I'm triggered. But that's because I've had longer term treatment, and as a therapist you have to do a lot of work on yourself before you let loose to help other people, so there's been a long journey of getting to where I am today. But it doesn't mean that things can't trigger me now, and it doesn't mean that if I had another trauma it couldn't kick off again, because that's the nature of the beast. But it interests me that he had actually been sectioned and he had treatment, and yet there wasn't that help in place for him, knowing that history was there.
I think it was almost, it was missed. I think one of the things that, came out from Dave was the fact that things don't follow you. People don't join up the dots as much as they're supposed to. And I think one of the things I'm really passionate about is if you listen to the families, if I was listened to a little bit more throughout everything that happened with Dave, and not dismissed in the kind of, but she's just the wife. They could have learned a lot more from me. It's like people gave me lip service at the time, saying they were listening to me. They weren't really listening to what I was saying, because, I did know the full history. I did, I was there and I could verbalise for him, mostly when he couldn't verbalise it for himself, because Dave used to have this saying to all the professionals. He'd say, do you know what, if you ask me, I'll tell you everything's great. I'll tell you everything's fine, because I don't want you to ask these questions, because it's really difficult to answer these questions. You ask her and you'll get the absolute truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm passionate about, is actually having the whole picture is so important for professionals.
Well, of course it is. And it's something that we are getting better at in terms of mental health. I mean, when I first worked within the NHS as a counsellor, I worked in bereavement care and my only remit was the terminally ill. So if you weren't terminally ill, you couldn't see me. Now, okay, this is 30 years ago, but we had the only counselling service in a hospital in the whole of London. Wow. Now, when I was hospitalised 7 years ago and ended up having a horrendous medical negligence happen to me at that time, and I clearly said to them, I have PTSD, and I knew it had been triggered by what had happened. It took something like over a week for the mental health team to visit me. And they said, well, you're not on our books and we can't help you. And then I had to go through a process, because there was no help available, of applying, going through a waiting period. And 7 years later, I'm not at all ashamed to admit that, because what happened to me was, I mean, literally, they nearly killed me through the negligence that I suffered in that hospital. It's a miracle that I walked out of it alive, never mind with PTSD. And I'm still having treatment now, because there's been so many, you have so much of trauma therapy, then you have to have a break, then you have to go back on the waiting list. And we've got a long way to go yet before there is things in place that really could turn people's lives around. I'm lucky. I'm a trained therapist. I know what I need. I know what I'm looking for, and I know how to manage things while I'm waiting. But most people don't.
No, and that's what it's about, isn't it? It's knowing your trigger points. It's knowing how to handle it. It's knowing that sometimes you can sit in it, but you just can't stay there. And how do you get yourself out of it once you're actually in that place? And I think that's to do with education. It's about people talking more. It's about people actually kind of not being embarrassed about the fact that they have suffered or that they have had things happen, and actually educating other people.
I totally agree, Jo. And two things stand out to me when you're speaking. Two things strongly stand out to me. And one is how Dave's behaviour was judged rather than the cause of his behaviour. Mm-hmm. And you were judged because you stood by him.
And I think one of the little known things about families is they're not just judged from professionals. It also is really isolating, because when you are a caregiver for someone with PTSD and it gets quite bad, there can be drug use, which Dave had. He had drug use to help himself, but also importantly, not just to help his mental health, but it was also as a way of self-harming. He used to say to doctors, how the hell am I still alive after everything I've tried to do to myself?
Let's just stay with that for a second, Jo, because that's self-harming is very, very common, very, very common with PTSD. And if you look at, especially with the military, the guys are almost kind of taught, it's that thing where you go down the pub and you get slaughtered, and, you're smoking, drinking, all of those things traditionally have been the things. And they are other drugs, but they are just legal drugs. Mm. Nicotine is a drug. It affects the brain, catecholamine, so it has an effect on the brain. So does alcohol, and those kind of things are acceptable as long as, and I know from being married to a paratrooper, his mates thought he was so lucky being married to somebody who was so understanding. Although I'm not. It's not that I'm understanding. It's that I'm being sensible about what I want to come home. So when it was Airborne Forces weekend, I just said, you know what, you go on Friday and I don't want to see you until Sunday night.
Yeah.
Because I knew that he was going to be absolutely slaughtered all weekend. Now, when you look at how we nurture ourselves in life and how we do put our finger on the self-destruct button, there are so many things that lots of people do when they go out to a nightclub on a Saturday night or whatever that are actually self-destructive. But as long as their behavior doesn't take them to a place that's, not sociologically acceptable, it's okay. And that's really a bit sort of hypocritical, don't you think?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there is still a massive stigma where drug use is concerned. And I think with Dave, I mean, at one point he was taking at least over 4 grams of cocaine a day. He was also swallowing speed at the same time. I mean, how that man survived. And he used to say to himself, he ended up with a deviated septum, and he had to have an operation on that. He ended up with an immune system problem where he'd been taking cocaine, that much of it, for a period of time, but it then affects your blood. So, yeah, he ended up with a lot of medical problems because of it, which then almost triggered the self-hatred even more. So at first it made him feel that little bit more bolshier, a little bit more confidence. He felt like he was kind of in with the in crowd, but then it became where it was self-destructive. He was trying to take his own life through doing it, and he used to pass out, and not even know how he'd still be alive. But then he started to really loathe himself for who he turned into and what he turned into. And at no point did anyone come along and say, do you know what, is there anything I can do to help you to overcome this? So it almost kind of, people look at drug use and go, oh, well, automatically that's your problem. That's the problem before the mental health. But actually, I don't think that's the case in our situation anyway. The mental health caused the drug problem, but then the drug problem exaggerated the mental health purely because of the self-loathing and what the hell have I become? What kind of role model am I? I'm supposed to be a man who is strong and look at how weak I am. I have to give in to this drug. And of course, then that has an impact on the family, because obviously I was a teacher at the time. I couldn't go into work and say, yeah, well, this weekend has been really, really tough because, he has either got a lot of debt that he owes because of drugs, or because I can't get hold of him and I'm worried that I'm going to get that phone call at any time of the night or day saying that he's overdosed or he's got into a problem. Yeah. You can't share that with people because people are judgmental of you.
Yeah, well, in actual fact, when people are doing these things, whatever they're using, whether it's alcohol, whether it's cigarettes, or, because some people literally do chain smoke, or whether it is, other forms of drugs such as cocaine, what they're actually really trying to do is to escape their emotional pain. And I've done a lot of work with addicts over the years, and that is what they are trying to do. People use substances, and the thing that I always say to people when they're judgmental, and they're starting to say things in a very negative way about somebody who's got addictive problems to whatever substance, I always say to them one thing: okay, so try giving up sugar for a week. And they're like, what? And I say, well, the way that sugar, and I'm talking specifically about refined sugar, affects the system, it's a bit like heroin. So you won't even realize until you actually pay attention to your diet how much sugar you are actually taking. And they'll argue with me. They'll start off saying, when I've given talks about addiction, they start off saying, oh, well, it's easy. You just give up. I say, well, okay, do you realize how many things sugar is in? It's in milk. What? Yes, lactose is a form of sugar, sucrose, glucose, fructose. Do you eat fruit? Well, yeah, it's supposed to be healthy. Well, it's still got sugar in it. So I'm telling you, give up sugar completely for a week and then tell me you don't understand an addict. And when you really go into explaining how many things that go into their mouth every single day contain sugar, and they haven't even got a clue how much sugar they're actually eating or the effects it has on their brain or their body. It's not just, the chemicals that are in chocolate that give us the high, it's the sugar too. And with that high comes a crash. And everybody, almost without exception, has said to me, I couldn't do that. And at that point, I said, then instead of judging the addict, try looking at what pain they're trying to get away from and try and encourage them to get help.
And that's, I think, one of my passions is always look behind the behaviours of someone and understand what is driving that behaviour. Because nobody, as a small child, says, do you know what I want to do when I grow up? I want to be a gambler, or I want to be an alcoholic, or I want to be addicted to drugs. Nobody wants that for their life. There is something that's happened to make that happen. So look behind those behaviours and help them to address those, the things that have caused that behaviour. And I think that is what we found quite difficult, is it more or less becomes a secret that is held within the family, because you can't talk to family about it. You can't talk to your friends about it, because you know what you're going to, and why are you with him? What, you're going to get all of that all over again. And then you end up justifying why you're with this person. Well, I'm with him because I know inside of him, this is not who he is. Yeah. I know the soul inside that person, and he is a good person. And the more you defend that person, the more people go, see how disillusioned you are. See how in denial you are.
Now, let me just bring this in this, because I think this is really powerful what you're saying right now, Jo. Would people say the same thing about people who are morbidly obese and are being self-destructive in a different way? Because actually, the same thing applies, is that when you've got an eating disorder, because I prefer to call it disordered eating. And it's actually something that I train separately in. I have an interest in eating disorders because I see it as disordered eating, which comes from, again, emotional pain. How many of these people that are being so judgmental that you were not able to talk to, or most importantly, get support from in these difficult times, would say the same thing if they had a family member that was morbidly obese and actually making themselves ill slowly but surely through their lifestyle?
Because it's more acceptable. It's more acceptable than mental health. It's more acceptable than addiction.
But that's my point, Jo. It is still an addiction. It's just as I was saying about the cigarettes and the alcohol and the people that go out and get slaughtered on a Saturday night to a club. And there's absolutely no judgment in anything that I'm saying here. It's just about how we look at it. Is that those things are socially acceptable because most people do them.
Exactly. And I think at one point, I remember when Dave, he absolutely hated himself for what he turned into and the lengths that he'd gone to treat himself as well as harm himself. And he was quite open and always quite honest. He didn't hide any of it from any of the professionals. He didn't say, oh, well, she's just talking, and it's none of it's true. He always absolutely put his hands up to everything in a way to say, this is how bad my life has got. And I remember phoning up a drug rehabilitation place the day before he took his life. And I'd referred him to this place. And because I was quite desperate for anyone to just help him, anyone. And they phoned me up and they said, well, you've referred your husband. And I said, yes. You can't refer your husband. You're his wife. Well, who can refer him then? A professional or himself? Well, he's not in the mental place to be able to pick up that phone and refer himself into it. He's just not. It's not because he's in denial. It's not because he doesn't recognise that there's an issue. He does. That's another misconception. Oh, if you don't pick up the phone yourself, then you're in denial.
Yeah.
Some people just don't have the mental capacity. Their brain is taken up with too many other things that they just can't do it themselves. They need someone to either hold their hand or do it for them. And I said, you know what, I'll go, because at the time he was sleeping in the alleyway between mine and my next door neighbour's house, because I'd been told by the police that following everything that had happened, where he smashed the house up completely, he'd threatened one of the girls, things like that had happened. We'd had police negotiators in the house. We had women's aid. We had social services involved. I was told quite categorically, if you let him back into this house once he's been released, we cannot protect you. And so you're left with a choice then. Okay, I've got daughters, and one of them is classed as being a vulnerable adult because she's autistic. So what do I do? Do I let this person back in the house no matter how much I love them, but then if my children get hurt, then I'd never forgive myself.
At this point, and this is the thing that I find particularly tragic about your situation, is at this point, you've got a man who's got a long history. It's not that he's not been diagnosed. He's got a long history. He's been sectioned before. Why couldn't they section him at that point?
I think one of the things that was missing in Dave's case, quite categorically, people didn't communicate with each other. So there was a lot of things leading up to it where maybe the GP didn't have communication from the crisis team, and the crisis team didn't have communication from the TILS team, and the TILS team didn't have communication from combat stress. So all of those, they weren't all linked up together. And when he was arrested, the people that saw him when he was in custody didn't assess him, because on the computer he wasn't down as being under crisis management. So that opportunity was missed. So he wasn't sectioned from there. And so
can I just interject here for the listener, in case there is anybody out there that doesn't understand this? A Section 2A is something where somebody is sectioned on the basis that they are a danger to themselves or others. And you are describing very clearly a man that had elements of both.
He was clearly a danger to other people. He had a conversation with a psychologist, and she was amazing. And I can't ever take away from TILS and CTS, because their staff did completely understand him. He felt at ease talking to them. She phoned him up just to make an appointment. Unfortunately, we fell in a gap where TILS referred him to the complex mental health treatment team, but in the West Midlands, it hadn't quite been put in place, so there was a longer than average waiting time. And she phoned him up to make an appointment. And at the inquest, she said that was the illest man she had ever spoken to in 14 years of forensic psychology. She said he was in turmoil. And it was heart-wrenching. She actually cried on the stand. She never met him. She only spoke to him on the phone. And she said that he was so distraught. And he couldn't, all he kept repeating is, I can't go back to the home because I can't trust myself any longer. I don't trust myself that I'm safe. I don't trust myself that I won't harm my wife and kids. And I don't want to be that person. And she said the only thing that grounded him during that whole conversation was when she mentioned me and the kids. And then his voice, his tone changed. He became calmer. He reiterated how much he loved us, how we were his absolute world, and that he couldn't stand who he had turned into. And then he would wind himself back up again. He made threats to kill the mental health people. He was going to go to the mental health hospital, and he made threats to kill them all because he blamed them for putting a wedge between him and us, because we were getting such judgments and told that we can't be around him because he's so dangerous. To him, then, they were the enemy. So he became quite hateful towards mental health, and he wasn't up until that stage. He used to engage with everything, but he almost felt like nobody understood him and nobody cared. And she said if he had been sat in front of her, she would have sectioned him. And every single person at the inquest said, in hindsight, they should have sectioned him. And I think that's where my passion for let's do something before it gets to that stage, because it's no good at an inquest to say that, because you can't undo what's happened. It's happened. But if things had been put together earlier, if we've been listened to, if we've been supported more, then, you know, whatever happened on that day might not have happened.
So I'm very mindful, Jo, that this is a very emotive subject and I'm sure still very painful for you. But can you just touch on what happened when Dave committed suicide?
So under the advice of Women's Aid and the police, because he had come back to the house, we had a safeguarding marker on our house. That weekend he came back, I made 6 phone calls to the police because I wanted them to put him in a place of safety. To me, that's what getting the police involved meant. He was going to be sectioned. It was a good thing. He was going to be put, and I'd seen it could work. Sectioning works. It has worked for him in the past. And I made 6 phone calls that weekend. There was no available officers all weekend, so nobody came to my house. I didn't know what he was going to do. I didn't know that he wasn't going to try and break in during the night. I didn't know that he wasn't going to, you know, as soon as anyone stepped out the door, he wasn't going to attack them. It was weird because up until that point, I absolutely was never, ever, ever terrified of Dave. But at that point in time, I was terrified of him. I didn't know what he was capable of anymore because he didn't have control of his mind. He couldn't control what he was doing. And that's a really scary place to be in. For both me and the girls, we've got no family near us. So, you know, we were very much left on our own, basically. And I was advised to go and get a non-molestation order from the court to get him moved, because then they would class him as homeless. So they would put him somewhere safe so he could carry on his treatment. There was never any question, you know, it wasn't a divorce situation. It was just, for the time being, to be safe, we need to be separate. And as I returned from the court, you have to have it served by a bailiff. So the bailiffs met me at the house, and some really weird thing happened. Something in my head said, do not go in that house. Just don't go in there. I couldn't even explain to you what it was. I couldn't. And I took my keys off my key ring for my house keys for some unknown reason. And I waited for the bailiffs to turn up. They put me in their car and they said, just in case he comes out, and he was very, very volatile. Bearing in mind, the police had been with him in the morning because he'd been banging on the window trying to get in the house. My daughter, who's vulnerable, was absolutely, she was hiding, she was shaking because she didn't know what he was capable of anymore. So the police came, they spoke to him. Apparently he was quite calm. He was very polite. He didn't get up. He didn't raise any alarm bells whatsoever. And mental health services had phoned him in the morning, said that he was very polite and very amenable. Arranged to see him on the Thursday. He said, yes, I'll come along to the appointment. And I was locked in the car when these bailiffs came in, and they just came running out of my alleyway. And I didn't know, I was locked in, so I was banging on the windows trying to get out of this car, screaming at the top of my voice, because I thought he'd assaulted one of them. I thought maybe he'd run off. I didn't know what had happened. And, when the bailiffs came to the car, he said, I can't let you out. I can't let you out. Why can't you let me out? You just can't. And then an ambulance turned up literally within seconds. And I thought, hang on a minute. And they got a defib out. And I literally, okay, this is more serious than what I thought. Couldn't get out of this car. I was literally slamming on the sides of the car. He let me out and he said, he's gone. And I said, what do you mean he's gone? He's gone where? Has he run off somewhere? Oh, God, we'll have to find him. And he said, no, he's gone. And I was like, what do you mean he's gone? And then when he said he died, literally, I'm having to choke back. It's a memory that will never leave me.
I'm so sorry, Jo. Just take a breath a second. It's hard to imagine how scary and how trapped it may have felt while you were in that car and you could not get out, and then to actually get out and hear that news.
Yeah, I think a lot of it afterwards was the guilt of where I actually was when he was dying. I felt like I had caused it.
What do you mean by that? Where you were when he was dying?
I was at the court getting the non-molestation order. I always knew that me and the girls were his life. And if he ever thought that he would lose us, I couldn't ever leave him, because he wouldn't cope with it. He just wouldn't. He was that dedicated. And I found that one of the things I kept on about was, did the police let him know where I was? Because if they did, I've killed him. And it came out of the inquest that they said he knew, but I don't see how he knew, because, we weren't having conversations at that point. Somehow he knew where I was. And that thought, I think, will stay with me forever. Although in hindsight, I can look back and say, but I had no choice. I literally had no support. I had no one. Had nowhere to go. I had no support.
I think the most important thing that I would always say in this situation, either from a therapeutic point of view or as, just somebody caring, that the biggest single predictor of suicide is feeling a burden. And I'm hoping what I'm saying next may be a little bit helpful to you, in the sense that when you've got somebody who is at the point that Dave was at that juncture, you've got somebody who has got a lot of self-loathing because they're stuck in this cycle of PTSD that they can't break free from. They need that help. And I agree completely that sectioning when things are that bad can be a lifeline. So they've got this feeling a burden to themselves, but most importantly, it's feeling a burden to others. And it's something that is, to the person who's committing suicide, it's that feeling that if I'm no longer here, I will no longer be hurting them. And it's something that makes me quite cross when I hear people that say it's the coward's way out. And, they say all sorts of things about suicide, but actually you have to have a lot of courage to take your own life.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was quite hard was the psychologist, and I do have to say she was amazing. And I went up to her in the inquest. I'd never met her before. Publicly thanked her, and she said, "But I didn't do anything. I never even met him. You know what you did? You showed you cared.
Yeah.
You showed that he meant something to you and that he's a human being. And you went out of your way to phone everyone." And she really did. She even phoned the police on the Friday morning. She phoned the local police and said, "I am so concerned. He is such a danger to himself and to other people. We need to be aware, and we need a marker put on his name. There's already a marker on the house, so if you get a phone call," and unfortunately that was put on as part of the system that the police officers, when I phoned on the Friday night and all weekend, they didn't have access to. And the police officers that were with him just before he died didn't have access to that note on the computer. So they didn't know that a psychologist had phoned in voicing her grave concerns about him. So there's all little things that happened that could have made a difference. And I think that was the frustrating part. I know that when his story came out in the press, because, the amount of things that went wrong with Dave were I think I've never even listed them all, but I think whenever I tell anyone, they are absolutely gobsmacked at the amount of things that went wrong.
Yeah.
And I had people commenting on it saying, "Oh, well, didn't she fail him by not letting him back in the house? What kind of wife does that?" And I think, you don't know what I've lived with and stood by, and it wasn't out of the fact that I didn't love him. I thought people would take it more seriously, and even
well, just a second. What a horrible thing to say.
It's quite, I mean, I remember the ITV producer saying to me at the time, "You could be Jesus Christ walking around wearing white and people would still have something negative to say. Don't take any notice of them." And even my daughters have such a hard time dealing with it and remembering everything that went on. And, they've suffered mental health problems ever since he took his life, and they don't receive any support. It's really difficult for families afterwards. They don't receive any support whatsoever, which is another thing I'm quite passionate about.
So let's talk about that, because you've set up For the Fallen, and tell me about that. Obviously you are very passionate about it, and you have every reason to be. But tell me about For the Fallen.
I think it came about because of our experience. We don't have a big family network, and that started to disappear over a period of time because of Dave's PTSD, because he was so hard to handle and be around. A lot of family members go, "Do you know what, I just can't with this family." So you end up becoming quite just as a family unit on your own. And after he died, there was literally no support, because we had no family. We had no one. Everyone shares the article. Everyone says, "Oh, that's really sad. Oh, rest in peace." But actually, what's happening with the family, that they need people to reach out to them and support them and talk to them and remember things about that person and guide them a little bit. And I found that there wasn't anything in place at all for families in the military community. So I set up a support group where I started getting together some of the other families that had been bereaved by suicide, just to offer peer-to-peer support, so that there's nothing more powerful than you not having to explain everything you're feeling and thinking.
Yeah.
And someone else saying, I get it. I totally get where you're coming from.
Yeah.
And I think, around then, in 2018, there were a lot of people, it was quite a high suicide rate in 2018. And there was a lot of families that were in the press. So, we managed to bring them all together. We did an ITV news item together in the December. And gradually over the next couple of years, it gained momentum. I turned it into a CIC in 2019, purely so that we can make more of an impact and that we can actually, the basis is as a legacy to those people that have died. It's very important. I'm very passionate about the fact that I want people to remember who Dave was. He was a good man. And he was, why am I getting emotional? He was very much loved. And I almost don't want people to focus on how he died.
Your passion is from a place of caring.
Yeah, and I think caring for the families, because I am one of them. I understand how isolating it is. I was isolated when I looked after Dave. I was isolated through all of that. And then I was even more isolated when I was bereaved. And I felt that people kind of treated those who've been bereaved by suicide a little bit differently. There's kind of a little bit of a stigma still, if you think of how we look at suicide.
Yeah.
And families are treated the same. And I wanted to bring them together so they had a collective voice, so that they could use their experiences to help educate people on what they noticed first of all. So those little triggers, what happened before it got to the crisis point.
Well, there is a massive stigma around suicide, and it has always been there, but it's sad to me that it's still there to such a degree, because when you're talking about 2018, you're not talking about a long time ago. And one of the things that I discovered when researching my family tree, when I was writing my book, I didn't even know that my aunt, who was my father's sister, had been married. And nothing was ever discussed throughout the whole of my childhood. Nobody ever mentioned it. So I discovered through researching that she had been married, and then that her husband had died at the age of 27. So I literally sent away for his death certificate, because I thought, well, that's very strange. And I wonder if he had tuberculosis, because my father had it and my other uncle died from it. So it was just a curiosity thing as part of writing my book. Imagine the shock I got when nobody in the family had ever spoken about it at all, when I discovered that actually my uncle had killed himself.
Yeah.
And I only found that out by reading his death certificate. I found out exactly how he'd killed himself and where he had done it, because it was all there in black and white. And then suddenly it was just this massive aha moment, because that particular aunt was very shut down. I always thought of her as quite cold, but when I look back on it now as a person with all the knowledge I've got today, looking back at what it was like for her, having to live with what had happened in a very small town with the stigma attached to it, and the fact that my family never even spoke about it, she probably was just very shut down emotionally, because there was what you're describing is nowhere to go with your feelings. Yeah.
And I think I ended up under crisis management myself. I was on 150 milligrams of sertraline a day. I ended up having to give up my career because I just couldn't function anymore. And that's one of the things I think that's really hard for families and a lot of widows, is basically your life and how you knew it and how it was mapped out and how secure you felt in that person's love and how you built all of this together, it's chucked up in the air and you're left with all of these like feathers coming down from the air, and you're trying to grab them and put together some sort of life for yourself because you have no choice but to carry on.
Yeah.
And I think part of that was for the fallen creating that to just let other people know that they are cared about and that they are honoured and their loved one is honoured and they won't be forgotten no matter what, what we try and do. It will always be in honour of our loved ones because that is so important to families. They won't have the adulation of the fact that they were killed in combat. But a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have died through mental health injuries attributed to their service. But that won't be recognised. And that's quite hard to kind of grab your head around, really. I have got a war widow's pension. I have got an attributed pension where, it has been acknowledged that it was attributed to his service.
Yeah.
And I've kind of used that in a way to highlight how people looking from the outside in think that families who have been bereaved by suicide are no longer prejudiced against, and the stigma does not exist anymore because we talk about mental health. But actually, it is there, but the only people that can tell you it's still there and give you examples of it are the actual families.
Well, of course, because they're the people who've experienced it. And, as you're aware, Gary was killed 39 years ago in the Falklands. Can't really believe that I'm talking to somebody 39 years later. It just seems surreal at times because it is a lifetime. It's almost 40 years. But last year, somebody that, and I think this is an important point as well, as somebody that I knew committed suicide late last year, and we're still having suicides from the Falklands War. The interesting thing is that you can never judge a book by the cover, and I think that's the really important thing with this whole subject of suicide, because you've got a case where the person I'm speaking about appeared to be getting on okay, probably better than he had been for some time, has gone to live a new life somewhere. But actually, when your demons are still with you, that's just geography, and you're taking them wherever you go anyway. So sometimes people do appear to be okay, and then the suicide appears to be like a bolt out of the blue, and of course it never is. And at other times, it's in the case of Dave where there has been a longevity with distress and diagnosed PTSD, and it is quite obvious that there is a problem. But either way, there is too much of it still going on. And when I did a video on somebody else's suicide some years ago, the actual rate within the civilian life and the military life of suicide was very, very similar. And I'm particularly interested because I have a friend whose son served in Afghanistan, and I am particularly interested in it, and I'd be interested to see what comes out as the years go by, because I am wondering, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this, whether you think that there is more suicide around now and Afghan is perhaps a bigger trigger than others, or whether that is in Dave's case and other people's case where it just happens to be the end of a line of too much being in those war, in inverted commas, zones. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think there was a recent study which said that the actual prevalence of suicide was higher in those who have seen combat. So it didn't actually break it down into Afghan and Iraq only. It was amongst those who have seen combat. So I think that's the first time that's ever been publicly acknowledged.
Perhaps that's changed, and perhaps we can have a conversation after today and look into that, because it would be very interesting, actually. Because when I was doing the research some years ago, it was slightly higher of those who'd seen combat, but it wasn't significantly so. And definitely the suicide rate is more or less 75% male. Yeah, there are far more men that commit suicide than women. And perhaps that is to do as well with sociological elements, because men traditionally are seen as the people that keep it together and look after people. And when they can't, of course, they're going to feel a burden, so that goes with the whole theory behind it. But I am wondering, because I'm hearing so much of it, if there is something about Afghanistan within itself. And I think it would be...
Yeah, I mean, all I can say about Afghanistan is I remember Dave phoning me up from Afghan, and he said, "Jo, my mind's going.
Yeah.
It's starting again." He said, "This is worse than Iraq." And I never thought I'd be able to say that anything was worse than Iraq, but it's constant. And I think maybe we need to look at the different ways that combat has changed over the years. So Afghan and Iraq became more kind of mental combat, didn't it? Because you didn't quite know who your enemy was. It could be a little child, it could be a female, it could be a male, it could be somebody just walking on the street that you think is just, looking quite innocent, or, it could be someone who's making it blatant. So I think maybe that change in combat is probably more of the reasons why the mental health injuries are more prevalent lately.
I think it would be really interesting to see what comes out with regards to research within the next 10 years in particular, because of exactly that. And I know that for a lot of the guys that I speak to in terms of veterans of the Falklands War, they do talk about it as the last clean war. It was a case of you went somewhere, it had been invaded, you knew who the enemy was, you knew what you needed to do to actually win it, although technically on paper it was not something we should have been able to do. So we're incredibly proud of the fact that we did win, and we actually did it so quickly. But it was very different. And it was also for the guys that served around that time, what you're describing in Afghan is very similar to the kind of things they were up against in Northern Ireland, where they weren't even in a war situation. It was just the troubles, in inverted commas, but you never knew who the enemy was there in the same way.
Yeah, and I would say with Dave, I mean, one of the things that has come about is a lot of his PTSD probably started from Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And then it's like a catalogue, it's one experience after another. If you do Northern Ireland a couple of times, and then you do Bosnia, and then you do Iraq, and then you do Afghanistan, over a period of time, that all kind of builds up, doesn't it? It's very hard to distinguish, it was definitely that tour that caused the mental health injury. And I think at the moment, that's one of the things that I'm appealing to the MOD about is I put an application in to have Dave's name put on the Armed Forces Memorial at the Arboretum, because they have acknowledged that his death was caused by his service. Mm-hmm. But the criteria for a mental health injury is somewhat higher than anything else, and being able to prove for the purpose of being remembered that person died because of their service is another onerous task left on a family that's already having to deal with inquests, maybe service inquiries, a lot of other things that are going on legally.
So for those people who don't know Dave's story, when you met and when he came back after that period of time, he'd been sectioned, he'd had treatment, he was still serving then, wasn't he?
Yes. And he was always in the the reserves up until 2 years before he died.
So when he went to Afghan, this was after he'd already been sectioned and diagnosed with PTSD.
Yes, yeah, it was afterwards, and I've had to go through a lot to prove to the MOD that his death was, attributed to service, and that's quite difficult to do. As in 2.5 years later, I'm still fighting for his name. I'm still fighting for his honour, and a lot of families by this point kind of give up because it's very wearing. It's mentally draining, the amount you have to go into and the amount you have to prove. But I wouldn't have to prove this if it was physical. I have to prove it because it's mental and it's more difficult. I know that when his application to be on the Armed Forces Memorial was rejected, I then asked, okay, and how do I appeal that decision? I know that no other family member has ever appealed it before, but unless we appeal things, unless we challenge things, unless we educate people more on the aspects that have contributed to someone's death, how can we ever hope to change things going forward?
Well, the answer to that is we can't, and we can only change things by doing something differently.
We have to put our head above the parapet, no matter how uncomfortable it is, no matter how difficult it is for us to do. We have to do it in order to achieve what we want to achieve, which is that the stigma is reduced, that they are honoured if their death is attributed to their service, and that some of that is part of the stigma. We're reducing that stigma by talking about them, by sharing their stories, by being open with people and people being able to see the raw emotion that lies behind that. They may be able to tap into their empathy a little bit more and maybe be a little less judgmental.
Well, I think, whenever I talk about my aunt, I always say that because, my aunt was judged the same as obviously in very different circumstances, but in the same way that Dave was judged, my aunt was judged by her behavior. So, her behavior was she was standoffish. She was quite cold. She was kind of, when I look back on it, very insular. That was her way of handling it, obviously. And I feel very sad because I was a young child at the time. And obviously had I been older and had I known the whole story, being the person that I am, I would have wanted to sit down and talk with her and make it okay. That's just the nature of who I am as a person. But nobody ever did. All they did was judge her for, supposedly being this cold person. But where was she supposed to actually go with her feelings when there was such a stigma around suicide, full stop?
And one of the things that I think is quite hard for families is they all routinely get sent to crews. Everyone gets sent to crews. And where the military community is concerned, if there's been a history of PTSD, there is already trauma there from living with someone with PTSD. And then you add to that the trauma of suicide. It's quite a complex situation to unpick for families, and it's very damaging and very traumatic for them. They almost need specialist therapy.
Can you open that one up a bit, Jo? Because I actually don't tell people this very often, but after Gary died, I did volunteer for crews for some time before I went into actually professionally into bereavement care. And but I'm talking about nearly 40 years ago. Are you saying to me now then that that's kind of people's only place to go in general?
Yes, that is the routine place to be sent. I went to one session with crews and they might be really good for other people, but they weren't a good fit for me. I don't mean to be derogatory towards crews. For me, they weren't the right fit because I had to more or less educate the person about what living with someone with severe PTSD was actually like, for you to fight for them to stay alive, for you to fight everyone. And you feel like you have reached out to every single person you ever could, and they've all turned their back on you, and then that person has died.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. It's kind of an education to me, because it's not something I've looked at recently in terms of what is out there now. But, you know, having been a volunteer for them like almost 40 years ago, and hearing that that's just still where people are being sent. Again, I'm obviously pro crews, having done that stint with them, but I would have said for people who've had your kind of everyday type death and your everyday type of bereavement, I can't see, looking back on, you know, the training that you would get, that there would be anything in there. You know, it takes. And not just that, it takes a very specialized therapist. It's like I said to you earlier on when we were talking about the eating thing, I have done a separate qualification in eating disorders. You know, you need to, just like a doctor needs to be a specialist in neurology or whatever, yeah? You need to be a specialist in whichever area of psychology that you can't be the same counselor with a child that you can be with an adult, for example. So there's nothing going to be there in just ordinary training to cover the complexities of PTSD within the person that died, the person that the family that's left behind. And certainly there's not the same dynamics to a suicide as there are to a death, say, from a heart attack or cancer.
Yeah, I mean, I ended up obviously, I was under crisis management in the end, because that's another thing. The families need to be treated so much differently because they are at a heightened risk of actually taking their own life after a suicide, which is well documented everywhere. So they do need specialist care, and they do need it quite urgently and quickly.
Did you get what you needed with that?
Under the NHS, I was given a psychiatrist. I was given a nurse, a mental health nurse, that used to come in and see me every week and just check in that everything was okay. How were my thoughts? Things like that. But one of them turned around to me and said, "You've got PTSD, and everything that you're describing fits under the veteran's mental health route, because that's what you're describing. That I can't refer you because you don't fit under their pathway because you're not a veteran. And I don't know where to refer you, because if you've been raped, I know where to refer you. If you've been in a car accident, I know where to refer you. But for the type of trauma that you're coming to me with, I literally don't know where to refer you." And I ended up having to have private therapy with EMDR and CBT, 6 months of private therapy, because that's the only way that I could actually come out in a way that was safe for me.
Yeah.
But that was paid for by a military charity, and I was very lucky. I know that some of the families, I mean, only last week I had a daughter reach out to me, you know, and say that her mum was really, really struggling and you know, had been to her GP and wasn't getting the compassion or the empathy, hadn't been referred anyone. What do I do? I'm really worried. I managed to get her in contact with a military charity, and she literally had a Zoom assessment today. But should it be that system, or should we have something in place for families?
So, in an ideal world, because I find this so sad that, you know, it's been 30 years since I worked for the NHS, and things are much better, but they're still nevertheless not where they should be. There's no ifs or buts about that. But in an ideal world, would you say that there needs to be obviously more services within the NHS and mental health in general, but would you supply, where would you want the excess in cases like yourself to come from? Would you want that to be supplied by the MOD, by the NHS? What would it look like to you in your ideal world?
I think in my ideal world, I think in general, we all know that mental health services need more money. They've been chronically underfunded for many, many years. And I think under the pandemic, we're going to see a massive influx of people with anxiety issues and mental health issues. So I think, a lot of money for everyone in general needs to be pumped into mental health services. But I think where the families are concerned who have been bereaved within the military community, I do think if it's a serving family, the MOD should provide some therapy for that family. I know they get visiting officers, but that's not therapy. And a lot of these families, that's why they clutch onto our group, because, they've actually got people that they can speak to and that understand them, and they don't have to explain everything. And I think that it shouldn't be left to some of the charities. And to my knowledge, there's only 2 charities within the military community who actually still offer help to those who have been bereaved within the military community, which is quite sad. I think when you're a veteran's family, the NHS should be able to tap into the big funds that we've got going for veterans' mental health, because, the families should come under that. If they need support, they should be offered it, but from a mental health perspective as well as a practical perspective.
There was something that happened a couple of years ago, and there was some very negative things, said in my direction quite publicly. And the thing that really made me both sad, but also I found laughable, was that one of them things that was said was that I would automatically get NHS priority because I was a war widow. And I remember thinking, where on earth did you get that idea from? Firstly, when Gary died, there was absolutely nothing. And we were in a very unusual situation because the Falklands was the first time that we had to fight to get the bodies repatriated. That was the first time it was ever done. So between the death itself and the funeral, you're looking at 6 months when your whole life is on hold. And as you'll be aware from having that sort of understanding of military life, when somebody dies, you don't just lose them, you lose your home. You get a license to stay in it for 6 months. I have to say, in my case, they were great. And they did make allowances for the fact that, the funeral was going to take 6 months. So it wasn't sort of black and white and I had to be out bang on the dot or anything like that. They were very good. But there was no psychological support. The family's office were very, very good helping me sort out the paperwork and the things I needed to do in terms of that and the red tape. And I went to see a psychiatrist privately because I knew I needed help. And he actually said to me, well, you're very young and you're very pretty, and I think the best thing you can do is to go and get married again, and wrote me a prescription for antidepressants. And I remember looking at him and thinking, so there's something wrong with me if I don't go and do that. And so, the driver in me then was to go, and the way to fix myself was to move on with my life, which everybody was kind of encouraging me to do until I did it. And then, of course, it's wrong. And that's a whole different subject, isn't it? How you move on afterwards. But there was no psychological support at all. And it doesn't sound like it's that much better now.
No, and part of what For the Fallen is part of now is a research project with a consortium of lots and lots of different people, lots of universities, lots of charities, the devolved nations, everyone. And we're going to be doing a research project looking at this. So not only looking at the story of the people that have taken their life and the trigger points so that, interventions can actually be catered using the existing services to actually educate people and actually be put in place a lot earlier than what they would before. But we're also going to be doing an aftermath study, which to our knowledge is the first one that's ever been done. This type of research, the whole of it, is the first time that the lived experience of those bereaved by suicide in the military community has ever been looked at. But also the aftermath study will look at the impact of bereavement on that family. What is the impact on that family dynamic, the family relationships, the psychological implications of it, the financial implications of it? Because we do have a responsibility to support families. Part of the covenant is, when you look at it, the top layer of support is supposed to be for bereaved families alongside those who are injured both physically and mentally. But as yet, we haven't quite achieved that element with the families. So, why haven't we achieved that? And that's one of the things that I'm quite passionate about changing.
Well, I think, what you're doing is incredible, and it's a positive thing always to take any kind of trauma and channel your energy around it into something that can help others.
The reason why I'm doing this, and I never, ever want, when people go, "Oh, Jo, you're amazing," I go, "No, it's Dave. If Dave hadn't lived, and if he hadn't died the way that he died, then this wouldn't all be happening. So it's all thanks to him. I'm just the facilitator of his voice, and I was when he was alive, and I still am when he's no longer here, and I will continue to be, no matter what happens in my life, no matter how old I get. That will always be my driver in life, because I think there's this misconception that someone's died, and therefore you more or less have to forget that they lived. And how can you, when they're a part of your soul? You can't forget that they lived.
Do you think that is more prevalent because of suicide? Do you think that there's something about suicide, again, with the stigma that makes people want to urge you to move on from it?
Yeah, I think it's easier for other people if you don't keep speaking about that person, and if you don't keep speaking about the way that they died. But I don't see any dishonour in the way that Dave died. Like you said earlier, he had absolutely no alcohol and no drugs in his system when he died. He was the bravest of men, and he didn't do it to punish anyone. He did it because of his immense pain. He could see no way out of it, and he couldn't see his family go through anymore. And he knew that he was a cause of a lot of it, and that's what he couldn't live with. I mean, one of the songs we chose at his funeral was the Steel Day song "Happier," because that basically sums up why Dave took his life.
Well, as I say, and I always talk about this when I do talks on PTSD, and it's something that I've had for many years. It was initially undiagnosed, but eventually obviously was. But it's something that I've got a very passionate interest in that side of why people do what they do. I can't sit here and say that suicide's never crossed my mind. I'd be a liar if I said that. Of course it has. But I do impress you.
Along those lines, people need to recognise that we will never be able to stop all suicides, unfortunately.
Absolutely not. But I think it is important, the point that we've both been getting at and driving home in this conversation today, and I hope this conversation will help a lot of people to understand that you are very brave, and it's a courageous act to actually take your own life, because you don't see any other option in that moment. As you've described with Dave, obviously he was clean at the time. He wasn't under the influence of anything. And it is something that is a very clear thought when it happens, when that event happens. But it is that feeling of being a burden that is the strongest. And so it's not about it being anybody's fault or the responsibility lying, at the door of the wife or whoever wasn't, doing whatever.
People do that a lot, don't they?
Well,
people always want to point the finger at one particular thing or one particular person.
Absolutely, because we as a society, again, love scapegoats, and so if we can scapegoat one person and say, well, it was that person's fault. When I look back at the medical negligence and what happened to me in that hospital, and I took it to the high courts myself. I represented myself, which is highly unusual because most people have a solicitor, but it was very, very important for me, for my own self, to do this for me. And I got a result. I'm proud to say that there's never any admission of wrongdoing, but the actual result is the settlement. It's that simple, But I could see when I prepared that case and I went through the particulars of claim, and it was, as you're describing with Dave, it was one thing after another. I went through the alphabet when I prepared that for the court, and I went to double A, double B, double C. I went the way down again. There were that many failures. It was scary. And I showed this to somebody who was helping me at the time, and their comments were, reading that, either they were deliberately trying to kill you or that is gross negligence. And I would like to think it was the latter. Now that I'm removed from that court case and I can take a step back and I can look at it absolutely with complete objective thought, I can say that what happened was exactly what you're describing, and we need to learn from these things, is that the one doctor who didn't take it seriously when I first went to A&E, who should have done a lot more than they did in that moment, and when they went off shift, they should have made damn sure somebody else followed it up. It was like nobody took any of it seriously after that. And by the time I was actually taken into theatre, I was so ill that when I researched the case, I found a guy who'd had the same condition and who died within 7 hours. And when they actually took me into the operating theatre, it had been 12 for me.
Wow.
And the anaesthetist said to me, "You are so poorly, do not worry if when you wake up you have lost 3 or 4 days, because I'm going to keep you asleep." I mean, that's a polite way for an induced coma. "I'm going to keep you asleep because, of course, the danger is when you're that poorly that you're going to go into shock and you're going to die anyway." But looking back on that, there are two things that stand out with what you're saying that I think are really important to get across in this conversation. Is that a year later, I had a cardiac arrest and a stress cardiomyopathy in the same hospital. I have no PTSD symptoms around that event, even though technically I was dead for 2 minutes. Right? Now that's traumatic. That's a very traumatic event, and yet I have no PTSD symptoms around that. And the thing was, because I was completely taken care of, and they could not have done more for me if they'd tried. And I felt safe. Whereas in the first instance, I thought they'd left me in the corner to die, and I nearly did. And I felt very unsafe. So it's about the level of care, and it's therefore, obviously, you can see very clearly, what caused the trauma. Now, I can be very able to unpick that because of my understanding of psychology and the work that I do, and to be able to separate it. But there were so many missed opportunities for me to have been taken care of in that first incident, which is what made it negligent. And that is what you're describing, isn't it, Jo? You're describing so many missed opportunities.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the coroner said, because they've had an Article 2 inquest, which is where somebody is under the care of public bodies who are meant to preserve life, if they know that there is an imminent or possible risk that someone is going to die, they have a legal obligation to prevent that from happening.
Yes.
So it's your human right to life, basically. So the coroner judged that Dave's human right to life was violated. And so it ended up with Regulation 28 issued by the Chief Coroner of England to two different health authorities, West and Midlands Police, and a couple of other people were notified about it as well. And I think one of the things that she said that was the predominant thing with Dave was people didn't take account of the accumulative effects of the mental health.
Yes.
So they weren't aware of the build-up and the things that were happening behind the scenes. So there wasn't this overall arching picture of everything. Everyone dealt with it from their snippet, but didn't tell the other person about what they'd just seen. And that's what came out of the inquest from everyone who attended, when they actually heard everything from start to finish. It was quite astounding. I mean, even from the January in 2018, where he was assessed under combat stress, and he went for 2-week residential to be assessed. And he found that really difficult because he had massive social anxiety. He didn't interact with people very well. He'd put his hood up over his head. He'd put his earphones in his ear, because that was the way that he kind of kept himself to himself, because he wasn't quite clued up on the social aspects of things. He found people very difficult to trust. And they said that he wasn't suitable for the group sessions for the 6-week treatment program. And they said that they were going to refer him to TILS, which they never did. So they didn't follow up on their own discharge. And that goes back to the January of 2018. So, there was all of those. It wasn't just the week or 2 weeks before. It went further back than that.
And that's the point we're talking about, is the layers. It's like I was saying about when I was in that hospital. If there had been just one thing that had gone wrong, if there'd been one thing that was unfortunate or missed or forgotten about, it would not have been traumatic in the same way. But it was a catalogue of one thing after another thing after another thing. It was things like being left on a morphine pump for 14 hours with nobody monitoring it.
And I think that's the difficulty, isn't it? And how do you keep your reserves up as a human being who is quite ill, to keep having faith in those professionals? And then obviously you're going to become a little bit kind of cynical. You're going to become a little bit hard to maybe interact with, a little bit like, I've heard this all before. And then that's used against you. That's like, oh, look, they're quite difficult, aren't they? They're quite difficult to deal with, or they don't quite engage in a positive way anymore. But that's because you failed again and again and again.
Well, it's also about common sense, and it's about communication, but because obviously I'm talking about a scenario in a hospital where there are different teams of people that need to communicate with each other. And I've got a doctor giving me a hard time for the fact that I haven't got out of bed and done a long walk when I've got more tubes in me than I could count, and I've had literally nothing but a saline drip for 5 days. So there's not 1 ounce of nutrition in my body, because at that point I wasn't on TPN. I wasn't being fed.
Yeah.
So, most people who've had nothing but fluids for 5 days are pretty weak anyway.
Yeah.
If you think about what you would be like, say, when you've had, say, a virus, upset tummy or something, but add that to a massive surgery and being in intensive care, blah, blah, blah. And you're getting a hard time because you haven't been for a long walk. And I can say honestly now, I was lying there, and if I'd had the energy, I would have thumped the guy, but at the time I just thought, you shut down. And when PTSD kicks in, and this is the thing that I think is really important for people to understand, is that when PTSD kicks in, you do shut down. And the more you get judged and the less help you get, the more you shut down. And that is what you're describing.
And then you're judged for shutting down.
Absolutely.
So it's like being on a hamster wheel.
Yeah.
You're constantly going round on, because then more people will kind of blame you. Oh, well, it's your fault. You didn't get the help because, you stopped engaging. But I stopped engaging because you taught me that even if I engaged, I wasn't going to be listened to.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that is so important, that irrespective of what the problem is, and you're describing that with what you've set up with For the Fallen, whatever the problem, the most important thing is being heard.
Exactly, and being validated, as in, people aren't going to argue against you and say, well, that didn't happen, or, my opinion is my opinion, and what I've seen is what I've seen, and nobody can argue with me against that. Even if they don't like to hear it, they can't argue with me and tell me it's not the truth, because it is, it's my truth. And that's what people need to be empowered to do, is sit in their own truth, but use it to a positive end rather than a bitter end. I never wanted to be someone that was caught up with bitterness and hatred of people. And I could have very easily gone that way if I'd allowed myself. But that wouldn't be honouring Dave, because he didn't want to see me like that. He wanted me to be happy. So I wouldn't be happy. I mean, if you're bitter and you're harbouring grudges against people, you're not harming those people, you're harming yourself. So what is the point?
That's very true, Jo. And I think the things that we've discussed today are not the most comfortable of things to talk about. But the more we do talk about them, the more we educate people, the more we get an understanding out there of mental health in all of its different facets, the better things will get. And, we have got a time coming up where it's going to be very trying. We've had a very unprecedented time with lockdowns. And I think I totally agree with you. I think we've got a lot of anxiety about to emerge, because it's kind of like when I look to my work with the terminally ill, when somebody is focused on looking after that person who is dying, they've got a job to do, and they do it, and it hits them after the event in a way that they often don't expect, and so lockdown is something that some people aren't coping with it very well, but others are just getting on with it because that's what we have to do. But it's when that fear is removed, and when we're, in inverted commas, going back to normal, or whatever normal is going to be now, that's when things start to surface.
The place of safety, which is your home, which has been quite fine to be in, some people are going to find that quite difficult to go out of their place of safety and go back into the world and associate with people. That is going to be quite difficult for some people. And going back to what you were saying about the families, when they're terminally ill and their life has been, that person, it's exactly the same when you're a caregiver for someone with severe PTSD. Basically, when Dave died, who was I? Because everything had been geared up for years to be about reducing his stressors, reducing things within the home that wouldn't trigger him, walking on the eggshells, all of those stereotypical things
Yes.
Everything, appointments, everything has revolved around Dave. So without Dave, who was I? And I think that's when I kind of did take a step back and reevaluate everything and why I've kind of gone into this area and left my teaching profession, because my passion lies in this now, and that's what happens in life. You have different passions throughout your life, and that's what you should go with.
So who are you, Jo? Are you a campaigner? Are you somebody who's learning more about themselves now? Somebody who's growing in a very different way? Who are you?
I would say that I'm a mixture of all of those. I think we're always learning about ourselves, and we're always learning about how we cope with things and evaluating ourselves and reflecting. But I would say I'm a campaigner as well as an advocate for PTSD, understanding in education, as well as families, and having their voices heard and getting them support and bringing them collectively together and having their loved ones remembered and honoured in the way that they should be, not only through research, but any other means that we can find. And I think that I'm just an evolved version. I mean, I know this probably sounds really cliched, but I wouldn't change anything that's happened. I would change probably the outcome of what happened with Dave, but I'm thankful for everything that, I've lived through and for his existence, because he is part of who I am now. So without him, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing and be the person that I am today.
Well, you certainly have come on in leaps and bounds in terms of what you're doing for suicide and the organization you're running and the things that you're doing to help with research and everything that you're campaigning for. So I really wish you all the best with that, and it's been so good talking to you today, and I hope we have really helped to educate a few people about this very difficult subject.
And I hope that we've encouraged people who have been bereaved by suicide to reach out for support and to also talk openly about their loved ones. There is no stigma, and you should be honouring the fact that they lived and their memories.
Absolutely. And when this goes live, we will put a link underneath so that people can find you, Jo. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That concludes episode 11 of Alternate Realities. Thank you for listening today, and I hope you found the episode both interesting and informative, albeit it may have been a tough listen. Since we recorded today's episode, Jo has become a visiting scholar and peer researcher for Northumbria University and is part of their research team at the Northern Hub for Veterans and Families Research. The project they're working on at the moment is called One is Too Many, funded by the Armed Forces Covenant Trust Fund. This project is a co-production of research using lived experience of those bereaved by suicide in the military community in order to produce policy and procedural changes. It is so needed. It is almost 70 years since my uncle committed suicide, and I should not have had to find out that that was his manner of death by applying for his death certificate. It is a testament to the times back then that it was a subject that was just so entrenched in stigma that it was just not spoken about. Today, things are a little bit better, but as you will have heard from the conversation, there's still a long way to go, both in helping people before they get to the point where they feel that life is actually no longer tolerable. And should the worst happen, there should be more help, more understanding, and less judgment on those families leading up to those events and certainly afterwards, so that everybody gets the support that they need. We wish Jo all the best in the future, and we hope that not only is the project successful, but that her organisation For the Fallen goes from strength to strength, so that families have a network, and that in the years to come, things will never be as bad as they have been before us. Episode 12 will be out shortly. Bye for now.